Every village holds its silence, but the silence of Saint Elora was speaking. A single empty pew once filled with whispered prayers, now echoed with an invisible scream no one dared acknowledge. No words were spoken, yet everything was said. Today I'll tell you the story of a secret that didn't just destroy one life, but gripped the very soul of an entire village. The question isn't just who did it, it's who hid it. It was the sort of Sunday morning where the stillness seemed rehearsed, where each chime of St. Hilda's church bells carried not just routine but a practiced restraint, as if the village of Elmridge itself was holding its breath beneath the facade of tradition. The sun spilled through pale clouds like diluted wine, casting a silvery haze on cobbled paths leading to the old chapel whose stones whispered with age. The congregation shuffled in on cue, their movements polite, their greetings hollow. The Harcourt sisters in their identical lilac coats nodded with vague smiles. The widow Blevins, her eyes dark as sealed letters, sat as always with her gloved hands folded over a Bible she never opened, and the Delaney twins whispered their hymns with more fear than faith, as though afraid the words might summon something they couldn't send back. Third pew from the front, beneath the cracked blue of the stained glass angel, sat Miss Eloan Clark still and composed in a plum coat that held the scent of dry paper and rain. In her gloved hand a well-worn hymn book, in her pocket, a sprig of dried rosemary, a silent ritual she never explained. Eloan did not believe in coincidence. She believed in the language of hesitation, in the stories told by avoided eye contact and the way hands trembled slightly at certain verses. This morning her gaze rested on Mrs. Winifred Hale, who sat alone by the far aisle, her body stiff as porcelain, her jaw clenched too tight, and her eyes darting, searching not ahead, but over her shoulder. A woman once known for saying, "Silence has a shape if you learn to see it," now looked as though it had finally taken form. Reverend Aldrich stepped into the pulpit with a sermon titled, "What Lies Beneath," his tone mild but his words oddly precise, a soft warning for a place where secrets festered beneath rose bushes and lace curtains. Eloan caught the faint twitch of discomfort from Mr. Benson, the pharmacist, who adjusted his collar while his wife stared ahead with the glassy focus of denial. Everything in form remained typical, but the air had thickened, the light too sharp, the calm almost brittle. And then it happened, not with a scream but with a whisper of disarray. As the organist reached the second verse of "Abide with Me," a thud echoed, subtle yet jarring, the fall of a hymn book, the faltering knees of Mrs. Hale, and then her sudden collapse sideways into the pew with a gasp that sounded too much like a confession. The church froze, the kind of silence that doesn't just fall but lands, a dead weight pressing against every chest. The Reverend stumbled on his words. Mrs. Penworthy surged forward with a bottle of smelling salts she carried everywhere in the hope of being needed, and a child began to cry somewhere near the back, as if sensing something the adults dared not name. Eloan was already on her feet, not with urgency, but with slow deliberate grace, her eyes sharp with knowing. Because she had seen it in Mrs. Hale's face, not fear, not confusion, but recognition. The tremble in her lips was not that of someone overwhelmed by heat or faintness, it was the expression of a person who had heard what they were never meant to hear. Clutching the pew, Winifred whispered through pale lips, "It spoke behind me." A voice, it said, but the words faded beneath the flurry of parishioners and the vicar's attempts to restore order. Later, people would mutter excuses, the close air, the lilies near the altar, the weight of sorrow, but Eloan knew what she had seen. And more importantly, what Mrs. Hale had seen, or heard. After the crowd began to disperse, polite concern giving way to the comfort of forgetting, Eloan remained, eyes fixed on the row behind Winifred. That pew had been empty, unmistakably, and yet Mrs. Hale had looked directly at it, not by chance, but as though something or someone had been there. As silence reclaimed the church like a slow tide, Eloan moved, discreet and unhurried, to the spot. She did not stoop like one searching for evidence, she merely noticed, and what she noticed chilled her more than the draught that stirred the hymn books. There, in the air was a scent out of place, not the beeswax, not the must of old stone, but something sharper, bitter, almost medicinal, with a darker undertone, that hinted at something poisonous, something meant to unsettle. On the polished wood of the pew, a fresh scratch marred the finish, a shallow gouge, too recent to be forgotten, too intentional to be ignored. It curved like the scrape of a cane or a pointed heel dragged carelessly, or purposefully backward. She pressed her gloved fingers against it. The dust lay undisturbed on the rest of the pew, except there. Someone had stood there. Recently. Silently. Unseen. Eloin said nothing to the vicar. He was too busy offering balm to rattled nerves. Besides, truth, she knew, had a way of lingering long after the sermon ends. Sometimes it whispered from the void, sometimes it waited, patient as rot. But today, it had spoken, and only one woman had heard it. Elora's chapel had long stood at the edge of the village like a forgotten sentinel, its grey stones weeping with moss and memory, and though its pews had thinned over the years, the ghosts, both real and whispered, had never truly left. When Mrs. Audley, a woman known for her quiet routines and iron composure, collapsed during morning service, the villagers exchanged looks, but no words. In places like these, silence often does the work of denial. The vicar offered a vague prayer, someone fetched water, and by the time she was helped outside, the incident had already begun its slow burial under polite avoidance. Only Iris Hargrove watched with an unblinking eye. She had lived through 2 wars, outlived 3 husbands, and understood the difference between a fainting spell and the shock of seeing something that should not be. She visited Mrs. Audley 3 evenings later, bringing a lavender cake and feigned small talk, but what she found was unsettling. A house too quiet, curtains drawn, even in daylight, mirrors covered with lace doilies, and the lady of the house shrinking in her armchair like a shadow trying not to be noticed. When the church bells rang distantly, not even loud enough to disturb a cat, Mrs. Audley spilled her tea as if struck. Her lips moved, but no sound came, and her eyes were fixed not on Iris, but on the hallway behind her, where nothing stood but a grandfather clock that hadn't ticked in years. There was a smell too, bitter, medicinal, and faintly metallic, as if something deeper than fear had taken root. And then came Mr. Thorne. He arrived on a rain-slicked Wednesday, his shoes polished, coat perfectly dry, though no carriage had been seen. He carried a single leather case, long and narrow, the kind used more for instruments than clothes. He introduced himself with quiet civility to the vicar, and made a generous offering to gain access to parish records. His interest, he claimed, was in genealogy. But it was soon clear he wasn't looking to build a family tree, he was looking to exhume one. Iris, through a careful web of observation and housemaid whispers, learned that his attention was not on recent decades, but precisely fixed on the years between 1889 and 1910, years tied to hushed tragedies, a fire in the rectory nursery that killed no one officially, but was said to have left a child missing, a midwife who walked into the woods one foggy evening and never returned, and a string of infant baptisms that chillingly had no death or marriage records to follow. Thorne's notebook, seen briefly by a boy delivering coal, was filled with names no one remembered, and symbols no one could explain. He asked about chalices, old relics, and once late at night, was seen standing alone in the churchyard, lips moving in a language older than Latin. Rumors swelled like tidewater. The innkeeper swore his lamp dimmed each time Thorne walked past. Miss Pelling, the retired schoolmistress, said she dreamed of hymns being sung backward, and a farmer's dog was found trembling beside an unmarked grave, its eyes wide and teeth bared at the earth itself. As tension gripped the village like cold fingers around a throat, Iris pieced together something terrifying. Thorne wasn't tracing bloodlines, he was severing them, unearthing secrets deliberately buried, names that had been erased not by time but by design. She began keeping a journal, watching the road to the chapel, noting how the shadows shifted differently when Thorne passed, how birds no longer sang on the steeple, how even the weather seemed to pause around him. She knew with a dread as quiet and ancient as the stones of the church, that something had been disturbed, and that St. Elora, with all its charm and stone-faced grace, had once again opened its doors not to worship, but to reckoning. When Mr. Ellison first arrived in the village of Ferncombe, a place where history clung to stone walls like mildew and secrets settled thick in the fog. He did so without fanfare, yet with a presence too quiet to be ordinary. Clad in charcoal grey and carrying a weather-beaten leather notebook, he walked with the deliberation of someone seeking not a destination but an echo, something just out of reach, just out of time. His arrival sparked the usual ripples of speculation among the villagers, who, like most close-knit communities, were masters at weaving narrative from nothing. Mr. Potts, the apothecary, declared him a solicitor chasing a forgotten heir, while old Colonel Renfield, forever haunted by the wars of men, was sure he was a writer sent to uncover hidden scandal. But it was Lydia Henslow, sharp-eyed and soft-spoken, who alone noticed his gaze lingering too long on the memorial plaque beside the church vestry, particularly on the name J. Bramhall, a boy presumed dead, though no grave ever confirmed it. The most unsettling shift, however, occurred not in the village square, but within the ivy-choked walls of Bramhall House, where Agatha Bramhall, the late captain's widow, suddenly abandoned her usual composure. A woman once revered for her crisp manners and an ironclad calm, Agatha now moved like someone whose world had begun to tilt, shutting curtains in daylight, scribbling out pages in her old diary, and standing silently at the window, as if watching for something only she could see. It was Miss Penelope Hartley, retired headmistress and lifelong observer of unspoken things, who decided to visit under the guise of returning a borrowed brooch. Inside she found the once cheerful drawing-room bare of family portraits, the hearth cold, and Agatha seated rigidly in a chair, with trembling hands wrapped around a teacup she hadn't sipped. When Penelope gently asked if she was well, Agatha did not answer directly, but muttered, "He has her eyes, and her way of waiting." No name was mentioned, but the weight of the sentence turned the air heavy. Meanwhile Mr. Ellison roamed the village with an unsettling calm, frequenting the graveyard's older section, where the ground dipped oddly near the weeping elm and moss-covered stones bore names long erased by rain and regret. He asked pointed questions at the parish records office, about the spring of 1913, about a cancelled christening, about a fire that was once dismissed as accidental. When he was seen speaking in hushed tones beneath the lich gate with Rose Temple, the vicar's niece, her face drained of color, and her laughter vanished for days. She no longer walked alone, no longer played the church organ, and began sleeping with her lamp on even in daylight. One night, during a thunderstorm that seemed to rise from the ground rather than the sky, the iron door to the Bramhall crypt was found ajar, though no key had been issued since 1925. The groundskeeper, a man who claimed no fear, resigned the next day, and left town without a word. That week, the village bell rang oddly, once at dawn, once at dusk, with no one admitting to pulling the rope. Miss Hartley, who had been piecing together fragments from whispered conversations and forgotten archives, finally confessed to the vicar that Ellison's surname was not unknown. It matched that of a maid who once served in the Bramhall household, and disappeared, soon after bearing a child out of wedlock, a scandal never spoken, but never fully hidden either. It became clear, Ellison was not chasing truth for curiosity's sake, but to reclaim something denied, a name, a story, perhaps even a mother's dignity. And Agatha, who had long carried the illusion of order, now saw it unravel with every step Ellison took toward the past she thought buried in soot and silence. The villagers felt the shift too. The wind seemed to hum differently through the trees. The church candles flickered, even when the windows were shut, and a lingering sense of anticipation settled over the green, as though the ground itself knew that something once silenced had begun to speak again. And on the final Sunday of the month, as rain misted like breath upon the stained glass windows, and the choir's voices trembled into discord, everyone turned, just for a moment, toward the back of the church, where Mr. Ellison stood, not with accusation, but with the quiet, devastating certainty of someone who had finally found the last missing piece. It began with the chill, an early frost that crept over Norbrook before the village clock had struck its final chime for October, and with it came a man no one remembered seeing arrive. He appeared as if stitched into the mist itself, lean frame wrapped in a brown overcoat that looked better suited to another century, a silver-capped cane he never truly used, and eyes the color of spent ash, dull, but watchful. He made his quiet pilgrimage each day, always at precisely 4, his steps drawing a perfect circle around the old Ridgeway chapel, whose stones had long since sunken into the earth like bones trying to disappear. Miss Eleanor Fitch, who had spent most of her 72 years observing more than speaking, noticed that the stranger's attention narrowed each time he passed one particular grave. Half swallowed by ivy, the stone cracked clean through, as though struck by a judgment from above. The name barely remained, Clara H., all else eroded by time and regret. Most villagers had forgotten Clara altogether, dismissing the tale of her disappearance as something between ghost story and cautionary tale. But Eleanor remembered the whispers, the closed-door glances, the way the organ had gone silent in the chapel for a full year after she vanished. It wasn't grief that kept the man standing there, it was recognition. His fingers hovered above the grave's edge like someone trying to summon a memory too dangerous to hold directly. On the third Thursday of the month, while the market distracted most with apple pies and new fabrics, Eleanor spotted Mary Lyles slipping into the chapel alone, her face unusually pale, her hands clenched tight around something tucked into her cardigan. Eleanor followed discreetly, and through the cracked vestry door she saw the girl kneel beside the old offering chest, and after whispering a few hurried words, slide a yellowed parchment into a narrow space beneath a rotting plank, her fingers shaking as if touched by cold from within. Her eyes darted once toward the doorway, and locked with Eleanor's just long enough for a silent warning to pass between them. Then she fled. That night, the chapel stood unusually silent, its lanterns unlit, and by morning the stranger had not returned. It was Reverend Wilkes who found him, seated beneath the gnarled yew behind the chapel, where the earliest graves leaned drunkenly into the earth, a place the children never ventured near after sunset. At first he looked asleep, his posture composed, head tilted gently back, but the cold stiffness, the unnatural tension at the corners of his lips, and the vacant half-lidded eyes made it clear he had crossed a threshold no living man returns from. Clutched in his hand was a torn slip of music parchment, its edges brittle and blackened like something scorched and then preserved. The name Clara H., just visible in faded ink, and beneath it a sequence of notes handwritten in blood red. Eleanor, who arrived shortly after the constable, noticed the vicar blanch upon seeing the page and whisper something about unfinished compositions and cursed tones before excusing himself to vomit behind the sacristy. Mary collapsed later that evening with a fever that no medicine could soothe, her dreams plagued by the sound of a lullaby no one else could hear. She would later speak in fragments, muttering about footsteps in the chapel when it was locked, shadows that echoed her name, and a piano that played from beneath the floor. Eleanor returned to the grave that night, under lantern light, drawn by instinct and unease, and was startled to see the once faded name now freshly etched, each letter sharp as if carved just hours before. And as the wind stirred the dead leaves around her feet, she thought she heard it again. Soft, deliberate notes floating through the soil beneath her, the beginning of a melody lost over a century ago, and with it the faintest whisper of a child's laughter, echoing in a voice long buried but never truly silenced. Miss Eloan Drake had always believed that nature spoke in warnings long before man ever sensed danger. Leaves turned before storms, birds fell silent before death, and foxgloves bloomed when secrets stirred. That year, spring arrived prematurely in the village of Greystone Hollow, its sun gentler but its whispers darker, and with it came the strange blooming of foxgloves along the crumbling churchyard wall, lavender-mouthed, freckled, and nodding like mourners at an invisible funeral. Eleanor noticed them on a Tuesday, their sudden appearance feeling less like coincidence and more like an omen, especially when, 3 days later, Alden Harrow was found lifeless on the bench beneath the yew tree, his spectacles folded neatly beside him, and a tonic bottle resting beside his hand, half full, sealed, and almost smug in its stillness. At first glance, the death seemed peaceful, as though he had simply drifted off into some final dreamless sleep. But Eloan, whose past was stitched with hidden nursing experience and years of tending to the ailments of others, sensed otherwise. The coroner's report, delivered with the kind of sterile detachment that made grief feel even colder, named the poison as Digellus purpura, foxglove, a toxin elegant in its design, and cruel in its patience. It did not strike swiftly. It lulled the body, whispering safety even as it unraveled the heart's rhythm until silence became permanent. The tonic bottle bore no signs of tampering, no residue or unnatural color. Its label was clean, the handwriting formal, but the slight curvature of the cord in digitalis betrayed a subtle, distinctly feminine flourish. And when questioned, Miss Heatherlyn at the apothecary swore she had neither prepared such a tonic nor sold anything similar to Mr. Harrow during his brief stay in the village. That in itself raised questions: who had provided it, and why? It was then that Eloan recalled a conversation weeks earlier with Agatha Merrin, a widow known for her well-kept rose garden and odd habit of preserving relics from her husband's long-fought illness. She had once mentioned, almost wistfully, keeping one of Major Merrin's old heart tonic bottles as a memory, a gesture Elliman had brushed off as sentimentality. But when the tonic bottle from Harrow's bench was turned over, the faint initials AM could be seen beneath years of dust and disuse, barely visible, but there. Agatha's face turned a shade paler than porcelain when she saw it, her mouth tightening before she insisted it had been missing for weeks. Elliman didn't believe Agatha capable of poisoning, not out of kindness, but lack of nerve. The murder, she suspected, had not been impulsive but calculated, and not driven by rage but something colder, perhaps retribution, perhaps pity. Yet it wasn't the bottle that chilled her blood, it was what Alden Harrow had clutched in his hand, a torn sweat-stained fragment of parchment, so tightly grasped the ink had bled into the ridges of his skin. It wasn't from a hymnal as first assumed, but a hastily written scripture line scrawled in blunt pencil: "The sins of the father shall visit the sons, even unto the third generation." The quote, taken from the book of Exodus, was not one recited in Sunday services, it was a warning, old as bloodlines, heavy with implication. When Elliman presented the scrap to the local vicar, his hands began to tremble as he read it, and he mumbled something about misunderstood theology before excusing himself, his collar damp with sudden sweat. Diana Merrin, Agatha's niece, said nothing at all, though her gaze faltered for a single moment, just long enough to glance across the churchyard to the shadowed grave of Samuel Weston, the village's former accountant, who had died under uncertain circumstances 15 years prior, and whose name had only recently begun reappearing in hushed conversations. Elliman had already found the letter Diana thought she had hidden, a sealed envelope marked with an old family crest long since out of use, locked in the bottom drawer of her uncle's study. It hadn't been mailed, it had been meant as a message, not to the public, but to someone in particular, someone who would understand its meaning, and know that the reckoning had begun. The choice of foxglove wasn't merely efficient, it was poetic, chosen by someone who wanted the death to feel gentle, as though offering forgiveness laced with judgment. And so the poison had done its part. But the past, buried, avoided, and stitched into silence, had finally spoken, and in doing so had named its inheritor. Miss Alira Thorncroft did not yet hold the entire shape of the truth, but she was certain of one terrible certainty, that Nathaniel Gray had unearthed something not buried in dusty parish records, but pulsing in the marrow of the village itself, a secret laced through memory and bloodline, and someone had ensured his silence before that truth could pass his lips. In the brooding lanes of Wickwood-on-Harrow, suspicion rooted itself like creeping briar in the damp stone of age-old cottages, curling around names murmured under breath at iron-wrought gates, and behind lace curtains drawn just slightly too early. The Reverend Halbert, though known for his tepid sermons and affection for marmalade, suddenly found himself under the kind of scrutiny one reserves for men who have seen too much and said too little. His connection to Gray was supposedly procedural, baptismal records, a letter of inquiry, but his demeanor had frayed, his voice faltering in his sermon on buried transgressions just days before the death. The tremble in his communion hand had not gone unnoticed, nor had the way he misquoted scripture, a verse about lineage and sin, twisted ever so slightly, as if to send a private warning. Eleanor Halbert, his niece, carried a different weight, poised in posture but brittle at the eyes, as if haunted by things unspoken. She had met Gray once before, that much Alira was sure of now, not by accident, but through some private arrangement, perhaps even regret. The way she flinched at his name was not grief but guilt. Then there was Mrs. Blythe Marwick, the widow who lived in the ivy-choked rectory, whose recent fainting in the choir loft had sparked whispers, not because of the collapse itself but because of what she had been holding, an antique apothecary vial, crusted at the rim, faintly scented of foxglove and lemon verbena. People spoke of her seeing figures in her orchard at night, of her drawing curtains against people who hadn't knocked. And though Miss Thorncroft sensed real fear in her, it was not the fear of the innocent, it was the fear of someone who recognized the method, if not the hand. Miss Thorncroft, who had long believed that silence was not merely absence but armor, listened keenly to what others avoided. Conversations bent strangely around the years 1908 to 1911, especially when the name Ashcombe surfaced, a family long buried, but never quite forgotten, their estate abandoned yet curiously maintained, its gravel path always swept clean by no one in particular. Guilt in Wickwood, she knew, was never confessed but folded delicately into gestures, a too long pause, a smile delayed by half a second, a subject dropped and trampled beneath forced laughter. And those around her, the reverend, the niece, the widow, were dropping far too much, far too often. She did not pry, she nudged. And so it was that on a mist-swept morning she found herself complimenting the wild columbine near the Lichgate, while speaking to Mr. Fenley, the old grave digger, who never needed to be prompted to remember. Yes, he said. Someone had been near the north wall the night Grey died, after evensong, after all had gone quiet. A silhouette, slight and cloaked, had walked across the graveyard path with a lantern that glowed not amber but with a pale, eerie blue, an oil lamp, old enough to have belonged to the Ashcombes themselves. The figure moved without hesitation, not searching but returning to a bench near the yew or perhaps to the stone crypt behind it. 10 minutes, no more. But in that time anything could have been hidden or removed. And when pressed gently, Fenley admitted something else, something he had not meant to remember. The family crypt of the Ashcombes, thought to be sealed since the war, had fresh scratches near the lock, small, recent, deliberate. Miss Thorncroft smiled her thanks, complimented his memory, and turned back toward the vicarage, but her mind remained fixed on that lantern's glow, like the light of something buried clawing its way back up into the living world, demanding to be known. The letter had not so much arrived as it had appeared, as though drawn out from the past by hands no longer living but determined to be heard, its pale cream paper, aged just enough to suggest it hadn't been written recently, yet the ink was bold, steady, as though the confession had waited in the shadows until the time was right. No return address, no seal to mark its journey, just a faint scent of faded violets and the smear of a wax thumbprint pressed too quickly, too nervously. It came just after the morning bells, but before the postman's usual rounds, placed not through the door but delicately between the pages of the village chronicle, resting in the vestry, a place no one had touched in weeks. Inside, the words were unnervingly calm. He remembered. I warned him once, but the past has its price, and it always collects. It was signed in the unmistakable hand of Agatha Warren, thought long dead, presumed lost in the fire that swallowed the Warren estate, one storm-lashed night 15 years ago, when the trees split, and the air cracked with thunder, and no one dared speak of what or who had truly been lost. Miss Alowen Price, the new librarian who seemed always to be listening, even when her eyes were turned to books, had been the first to notice that something was stirring in St. Willoughby, a village where silence had been practiced like a sacred ritual, and the sins of the past covered with ivy and thyme. She didn't believe in coincidence. Not when Mr. Ambrose Dalrymple, retired solicitor, unofficial historian, and notorious collector of other people's truths, was found at the base of the old bell tower, with a snapped neck and a bloodied palm, clutching a brass token marked with a rook, and the Roman numeral 7. Not when the chapel's ledger had been scrubbed clean only hours earlier, and not when the oil lantern in his study had burned all night, though the wick had long run dry. The letter she found was not the only anomaly. There were whispers now too, half heard in the grocer's, in the hush before the hymn began, in the way doors were double-bolted again, even though crime had not visited the village in years. She remembered the story of the Warren fire, not as it was told in public, but how it was murmured in drunken sorrow behind shut parlor doors. That Agatha had been seen the night before with a child's silver rattle tucked in her shawl and a journal under her arm, speaking to no one, yet looking as if she were speaking through someone. And now, 15 years later, her handwriting returns, not trembling or decayed, but deliberate, as if time itself had kept her preserved for this moment. Eloan, whose calm demeanor belied an instinct honed by solitude and ink, revisited Ambrose's cottage under the pretense of cataloguing his private collection. What she found instead was a room too neat, too arranged, as if whoever had been there last had wanted something to be found. A single page remained in his typewriter, just a sentence. The rook plays first, but the queen always remembers. On the shelf, behind a false row of encyclopedias, she discovered a box, wooden, bound with iron, its lock pried open. Inside, a broken locket containing a miniature of Agatha as a girl, a charred invitation to the Warren Midsummer Gala, and a chess piece carved from bone. The bishop. She understood now that the game was being resumed, not begun. The past had been disturbed, but not by mistake. No, this was the deliberate unsealing of a pact long buried. And in the sudden hush of the evening, as the wind stirred the ivy against the stone walls, and the bells tolled again, though no hand pulled the rope, Eloan Price whispered the words to herself that she knew someone else, somewhere nearby, had already said aloud. She never left, she only waited. She had not cried, not overtly, but something inside Eleanor Finch had visibly fractured, like a porcelain teacup that remains whole even after the first hairline crack, undetectable to the careless eye, but destined to give way under the slightest pressure. She sat motionless, her hands wrapped around the delicate china cup, as though it were the last thing anchoring her to the present, her gaze vacant, fixed not on Miss Hartley, who sat across from her, but on the swirling surface of the untouched tea, as if somewhere in that amber stillness lay the answer to a question she hadn't yet dared form aloud. The silence lingered through the pouring of a second cup, thick with unspoken things, until finally Eleanor exhaled, a slow, shallow breath that barely stirred the air. "I didn't write it," she said. The words brittle, nearly inaudible, spoken not with outrage, but a quiet despair that seemed older than grief, deeper than fear. There was no pleading in her tone, no protestation of innocence, only bewilderment, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted, and she'd been told it had always been this way. Miss Hartley didn't interrupt, didn't rush to fill the stillness. She knew well that truth, real truth, required space to reveal itself. The letter in question had not been delivered by post but discovered, almost too conveniently, tucked inside a hollowed-out hymnal, donated to the church's charity box. Its paper bore the faintly yellowed tint of expensive but aging stationery, its ink still fresh enough to glisten under certain light, and the signature, unmistakably Eleanor's, yet disturbingly wrong. The capital F in Finch looped too neatly, the descending stroke too clean, as if executed without the tremor that had become a constant companion to Eleanor's hand. Miss Hartley had seen her struggle last Christmas, her fingers stiff with cold, barely able to scrawl her name on cards that the girl from the bakery had helped her post. The woman before her now could not have composed that letter, not for lack of memory, but for lack of ability. And yet the words, oh the words, carefully chosen, deceptively simple, each sentence cloaked in remorse, regret, and a polished kind of grace that Eleanor had never possessed in written form. Most damning of all was the scripture, a verse so precisely quoted, so immaculately punctuated, it rang with the sterility of rehearsal. It was not the Eleanor Finch Miss Hartley knew, the woman who misquoted hymns with charming inconsistency, who replaced whole passages with whimsical approximations from childhood sermons. No, this was the hand of someone who studied her deeply. Not just her voice and gestures, but her absence, the things she did not say, the spaces she left blank, someone who had watched her long enough to mimic her essence, but who lacked the natural imperfections that came with intimacy. And it was that absence of imperfection, the flawlessness, that screamed deception. There were other details too, subtle, almost surgical. The envelope's seal bore a faint scent of lavender soap no longer sold in the village, but still available in certain shops 2 towns over, where Gregory Vane, the recently deceased historian, had reportedly visited just weeks before his untimely fall from the cliffs. The connection was faint, but it was enough to whisper that this forgery was not random, it was curated. A carefully planted seed designed not to exonerate, but to entangle. Miss Hartley's fingers hovered over the paper once more, her eyes narrowing at the way each line carried not the rush of confession, but the precision of a script rehearsed. Whoever had written it knew Eleanor, not just her habits, but her past, her silences, her vulnerabilities, her long-shelved grief, for a sister lost to shadows nearly 2 decades ago, and the garden behind the Finch estate where the ground had once been disturbed and then hurriedly leveled. Someone who feared that whatever Gregory Vane had uncovered, whatever he had dared to hint at before his final lecture, might pull those shadows back into the light. Someone with motive, access, and most chilling of all, patience. For forgery, Miss Hartley knew, was not just about replicating a hand, it was about understanding which words a person could never write, and daring to write them anyway. As the grandfather clock struck 5, and the light dimmed to a melancholy gold across the room, Miss Hartley folded the letter carefully, her breath slow, measured. This was no ordinary lie, this was design, intimate, surgical, and lethal in its precision. No one had dared speak her name aloud in 17 years, not since the freezing night when the river rose beyond its banks and swallowed both truth and reputation beneath its black waters. That same night, in the heart of the storm, young Reverend Holloway had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a flickering lamp, a scorched corner of scripture on his study table, and a locked vestry, whose key was found buried in mud 3 miles away. But something unspoken had stirred again within the aged stones of St. Elric Sain, first as a whisper beneath the bell tower, then as a scent, faint and oddly sweet, like crushed lilies and old smoke. Miss Althea Dawn, once a schoolmistress, now a quiet guardian of half-forgotten memories, was not a woman prone to superstition, but as she stood beneath the stained glass shadow of the Archangel Michael, she felt the past reach out like a breath across her skin. Behind a warped altar panel, long thought unmovable, she found a parish ledger, brittle with age and thick with mold. Between records of christenings and charitable givings, one entry stood out like a splinter, anonymous contribution, for the child's care, no name, no witness. The ink, unlike the rest, had not faded. That same day, a small stoppered bottle was found inside the rectory's hearth, untouched by soot, pristine but dusted with pine needles, not local. Its label, aged to appear ancient, bore a scripture verse slightly misquoted, a detail only someone deeply familiar with archaic Bible editions would notice. But it was the handwriting that stopped Althea cold, delicate, exact and eerily familiar. Years ago, that same looping script had been found in the margins of a book of poetry Reverend Holloway kept hidden in his chambers, a gift, it was said, from a woman whose name had been scratched out in every parish record. The handwriting had returned, and it wasn't alone. That night, guided by instinct and a growing sense of dread, Althea climbed the bell tower, a place long sealed after the lightning strike of 13 cracked its beams. As she ascended, the air thickened with cold and silence, broken only by the creak of ancient wood and the distant echo of an unseen step, too slow to be memory, too deliberate to be wind. Behind a splintered panel, marked faintly with initials, she uncovered something unspeakably intimate, a child's mitten, hardened with time, curled around a scorched hymnline that read, "Deliver us from hidden fire and forgotten flesh." It was written in a dialect, not spoken in 100 years, pulled from a variant book of hours known only to 3 surviving scholars. Beneath the mitten lay a photograph, sepia-toned, edges curled, depicting an infant held by gloved hands, the face of the adult just out of frame. Behind it, scrawled in the same unmistakable hand, "He must never know." Althea stared at the words until they blurred, not from age, but from a memory now rising within her, the night she'd seen a veiled woman weeping alone near the garden wall, long before the flood, long before the Reverend's final sermon. The placement of the clues wasn't random. Someone had constructed a trail, not merely to deceive, but to communicate. It was ritualistic, it was confessional. The cork of the bottle, once thought wax, was revealed to be sap from the withering pines, trees that grew only on the west end of the Holloway estate, land sealed after the investigation, land that had recently shown signs of trespass, disturbed earth, broken twigs, footprints too small for men, too firm for animals. Someone was returning, not to mourn, but to ensure the silence held, not to bury secrets, but to curate them, like artifacts in a reliquary of guilt. Miss Dawn, trembling now, closed the ledger and placed the mitten in her coat pocket, not as evidence, but as acknowledgement. Someone among them had never left at all. They had simply learned how to exist between moments, between prayers, and behind the eyes of those who refused to see. And now, the shadows they left behind were starting to speak. Carefully unfolding the brittle parchment of a forgotten vestry archive, one reluctantly released after weeks of formal petitioning, Miss Elowen Gray, known quietly in academic circles for her unnerving intuition, found herself seated among motes of dust and silence in the archives of St. Aurelia's, a chapel that had long grown moss over its shame. She sifted through loosely bundled papers marked only with the faded initials, and though nothing in the documents screamed scandal, the quietness of what wasn't said screamed louder. Among vestry minutes of late 1910, she discovered an entry so carefully worded it felt like a confession disguised as procedure. Administrative transition required, effective immediately upon recommendation of the diocesan council. Private matter resolved. There was no name, no blame, just a redacted resolution and a sudden void in continuity. The name of the curate, Alaric Weston, ceased to appear altogether from that point forward. But it was the next page that stilled her breath, a receipt, folded with unnatural precision, documenting a generous sum paid discreetly to an unnamed household in respect of pastoral complications. That term, pastoral complications, recurred again in a locked appendix, accessible only via an attached brass key she had found separately tucked behind a framed oil portrait of a former bishop, his eyes unusually dull, as if painted to forget. Upon unlocking the appendix, Elowen found no confessions, no letters, but something colder, a single line in Latin etched into a page otherwise left blank. Veritas non deleta, said Dormet, truth is not destroyed, it merely sleeps. Her instincts sharpened. In the baptismal records spanning early 1911, she found a lone entry, Matthew, no surname, baptized in extreme haste by a visiting deacon, whose name bore no further mention in church history. The mother's field was left not blank, but overwritten with a flourish of ink as though to smother the name entirely. There were no godparents, no familial notes, no public announcement in the village ledger, and yet no death record followed. Matthew had lived, but never openly. Whoever had arranged this concealment possessed both authority and motive, likely seated at the very table where decisions of piety were dressed in the robes of discretion. But the silence had begun to shift. Gregory Vale, a man initially introduced by local rumor as a dull antiquarian, was revealed upon cross-checking diocesan probate court records to be a solicitor's assistant, whose interest in the parish was less nostalgic than legal. His inquiries had unnerved the town clerk enough to log an informal complaint that Vale had pressed on matters not suited for rediscovery. Elowen uncovered that he had filed petitions for land tied to the original manse, citing obscure heirship clauses. As it emerged, Gregory was no academic but Matthew's son, the grandson of the disgraced Alaric Weston. Raised in exile, Matthew had kept his lineage locked away until death, passing only fragments to his son, who arrived seeking not only truth, but justice for inheritance withheld, and for a name erased before it was spoken. But 2 days after he retrieved a sealed envelope from the diocesan safe, Gregory was found beneath the ancient ash tree on the chapel grounds, neck broken not from fall but from force, the envelope missing. Elowen, now deeply entangled in a century-old reckoning, saw the threads tighten. This was no accident of heritage. It was preservation of control. What frightened her was not the brutality, but the precision. Someone still alive, or closely allied with the old guardians of the parish, had acted with deliberate timing, as if they'd been waiting decades for this moment to rise again. The space in the records, the overwritten name, the unclaimed grave, the ashes of a forgotten confession, each whispered that some truths are not buried, but planted. And now, one had begun to bloom. Behind the quiet charm of Heatherley Village, beneath its ivy-covered chapels and whispering woods, an old truth breathed in silence, one passed down not through stories, but through silence itself, buried in shame, and guarded by legacy. Miss Marlowe, whose gift lay in uncovering the hidden truths behind practiced smiles and tidy lives, felt something stir the moment she saw the old vestry ledger tucked away in the cellar. One glance was enough to notice an anomaly. A single entry for a child named Jonas, with his mother's name blotched by ink, and the father's line eerily left blank, as if someone in a moment of panic or guilt had deliberately obscured it. Yet what unsettled her more was what wasn't there. No mention of a burial, no baptismal closure, no grave. Jonas, she realized, hadn't died. He had simply vanished, but not from the earth, just from memory, as though erased by the collective will of a family, desperate to protect its name. Then came Thorn, a man who introduced himself as a folklore researcher, though his eyes carried the desperation of someone chasing something far more personal than legend. An informant at the county deeds office quietly mentioned that Thorn had been making inquiries about an old orphaned inheritance through a solicitor, digging through the archives of the wards and orphans department under a different name. Miss Marlowe sensed the truth. Thorn wasn't researching a myth. He was searching for proof, for identity, for a bloodline cut off by shame. But just days later, Thorn's body was found in the overgrown section of the vicarage garden. Coincidentally, the last place Jonas was ever seen alive, according to a half-forgotten recollection from an aging housemaid no one had believed. His death wasn't natural, not by a long shot. It was a warning, a surgical act of silence, a clear message. The light you uncovered has been buried again in darkness. Her investigation led Miss Marlowe to the Davenhalls, Heatherley's oldest and most powerful family, cloaked in charity and respectability, protected by a name that could not afford scandal. The family's iron matriarch, Agatha Davenhall, greeted questions with a cold smile and careful pauses, but her granddaughter Lily's face betrayed a flicker of panic each time Thorn's name arose. And when Miss Marlowe caught sight of an oil painting in their ancestral hallway, a young boy's face staring out with the same cleft chin and piercing gaze, Jonas was described to have everything locked into place. Agatha's younger sister, once rumored to have run away with a tutor in disgrace, had in truth been hidden away in a convent. Her child, Jonas, born in secret and wiped from the record. Thorn had unearthed that truth, unknowingly tugging on a thread that unraveled years of carefully guarded silence. His death wasn't born of hate, it was born of fear, of desperation, of a reputation so brittle it demanded blood to remain intact. Guilt clung to Lily, control to Agatha, and a silent complicity to the groundskeeper, who'd watched too many winters pass with his lips sealed. They were all bound together by a single truth, that Thorn hadn't just found a story, he'd found himself, and that cost him his life. As Miss Marlowe stood in the cold wind by the corner of the churchyard where his body had been discovered, she realized something. Heatherley's oldest trees didn't just cast shadows, they kept secrets, and some secrets weren't buried, they were simply waiting for someone else to dig too deep. Because the greatest fear isn't scandal, it's that scandal might one day speak. The village of Elmridge, long revered for its age-old rituals and a seemingly unshakable serenity, was once again unsettled, not by a storm or scandal, but by something far more spectral, a whisper that moved like smoke through stone. It was during the candle-lit evensong, when hymns rose like fragile prayers into the vaulted ceiling, that the first fracture of calm was felt, not seen. Miss Evelyn Braithwaite, seated in her usual pew beneath the stained glass of St. Gabriel, felt it before she heard it, a chill that brushed her nape, followed by a voice that did not echo yet seemed to breathe directly into her ear. He must never remember. Her hymn book slipped from her hands, her face turned ashen, and with a soft gasp she crumpled, trembling, as the congregation turned with murmurs that seemed both curious and afraid. Dr. Pendrell called it a fainting spell, but Miss Merriweather, who sat just 2 rows behind, swore she saw Evelyn's lips moving as if speaking to someone invisible. The whispers didn't stop. In the following days, others heard fragments, names, pleas, warnings, all spoken in a hush that seemed to rise from beneath the church floor itself. Yet it wasn't until the summer fair, a beloved Elmridge tradition filled with bunting, rosehip cordial, and brass band cheer, that the true undercurrent of unease surfaced. Beneath the jovial faces and baked goods, there lingered a tightness in smiles, an awkwardness in laughter, a sense that something unspoken had taken root. Miss Lydia Harrow, ever observant beneath her sun hat, noted how people avoided eye contact too quickly, how silence fell too fast when certain names were uttered. She moved from stall to stall with the ease of an elder, but her eyes were those of a hawk scanning for tremors in the earth. Then, in an act both subtle and deliberate, she requested the presence of 3 villagers for a private conversation in the vestry. Reverend Hale, Eleanor Bexley, and Arthur Pembridge, each arriving separately, each wearing the expression of someone who feared they might already be too late. Inside the shadowy quiet of St. Jude, away from the sound of distant laughter and children's games, Miss Harrow spoke, not with confrontation, but with clarity. She pieced together the return of a man no one expected, Vincent Hale, the vicar's estranged brother, thought to have perished abroad in disgrace years ago. But Vincent had come back under a false name, quietly, searching for something, or someone, he believed was stolen from him. It was he who unearthed the parish records sealed decades ago. It was he who whispered truths too volatile to be heard aloud. His knowledge had made him dangerous, and now he too was missing. Not officially, not yet, but his rented room stood empty, the sheets untouched, the lamp still burning. What Miss Harrow suspected, though not yet said, was that the whisper was not a ghost's voice, but a conscience, wielded with purpose, directed like a blade. And as she looked into the faces before her, Hale's composed guilt, Bexley's tightening jaw, Pembridge's twitching fingers, she knew the village wasn't haunted by the dead, but by those still breathing, those who had buried the truth in the earth beneath their feet and prayed no one would dig deep enough to find it. Yet something or someone had begun to dig, and this time, silence would no longer protect them. The reckoning had already begun, softly, like a prayer muttered behind closed lips, now rising into something much louder, something impossible to ignore. The chapel's ancient stones seemed to hold their breath as the final echoes of the bell faded into silence, the dusk light filtering through fractured stained glass like shards of forgotten memory. Outside, a low mist curled around the gravestones, veiling the village in the hush of impending revelation, while inside, the gathered few sat as though bound by invisible thread, tethered to one another, not by choice, but by a truth long buried in the marrow of the village itself. Mrs. Halbert stood not as an accuser, but as a reluctant messenger, her face weathered not by age, but by years of silent observation and unspoken grief. The tale she wove was no ordinary confession, but a haunting puzzle pieced together from the overlooked, the dismissed, and the deliberately concealed. It had begun, she revealed, not with a cry for help, but with a silence, a sudden terrible quiet in the garden, where Mr. Ashcombe, the retired historian, had been found lifeless among his lilies, a serene expression on his face that belied the violence within. To most, it had seemed a peaceful death, until the herb monkshood was found nearby, its roots torn and its petals, oddly damp as if recently handled. Then came the whispers of a sermon delivered by the Reverend a week prior, laced with obscure passages about bloodlines, guilt and a sin carried unknowingly through generations. It had been poetic, perhaps even beautiful, but too specific to be random. Mrs. Halbert had remembered it because it echoed something she'd read once, an old letter buried in the church archives, hinting at a wartime affair that ended in scandal and concealment. She spoke next of a missing diary, one kept by the deceased, long rumored to contain confessions about a liaison with a foreign nurse during the war, a union that had yielded a daughter, quietly sent away. The diary had vanished just days before the man's death, only to reappear, damaged, stained and torn in the base of a rusted offertory box, hidden beneath hymnals, dated from the summer of 1946. But even more disturbing was the discovery of a page, meticulously marked, that mentioned red fingers of guilt and death blooming in blue, a chilling poetic metaphor, matching the exact hue of monkshood's fatal blossom. It was then Mrs. Halbert named the woman living under a false identity, Miss Elspeth Greaves, the church archivist and recluse who had moved into the village 12 years prior, claiming to be a distant cousin of a long-dead parishioner. But records showed no such relation, and more striking was her uncanny resemblance to a photograph of Mr. Ashcombe's younger sister, believed to have died in a bombing during the Blitz. Elspeth, or rather Eleanor Ashcombe, had survived, fled, and reinvented herself, her shame too heavy to bear, her silence her penance. She had lived humbly, kept to herself, and guarded the truth not to deceive, but to preserve what little dignity her family still held. Yet someone else had unearthed this truth. That someone was the Reverend's niece Clara, a curious and ambitious young woman with a fondness for poetry and secrets. Her journal, found hidden behind a wall panel in the vicarage, contained veiled references: the bloom of guilt, the sister who watches, truth pressed between leaves. But more chilling still were her notes about the old shaving brush Mr. Ashcombe still used, passed down from his father, its bristles worn and brittle. It was through this brush, Mrs. Halbert explained, that the powdered monkshood had been introduced, absorbed gradually through the skin, its effects slow and cruel. Clara had not intended to kill, but to frighten the man into naming her as a beneficiary, as she believed herself entitled, a descendant of the village's buried bloodline. But her hand had slipped, not physically, but morally, and the line between justice and cruelty blurred fatally. The final twist came from Nurse Weatherby, now retired, who had once served the Ashcombe family, and admitted, in trembling voice, that she had seen Clara enter the herbarium the day before the man's death. She had kept silent, not out of loyalty, but out of fear of shattering the fragile calm the village had so carefully built around its ghosts. And so the poison did its work in silence, masked by routine, and the past claimed another life. But the tragedy Mrs. Halbert emphasized was not in the act itself, but in the chain of sorrow that led to it: shame passed down like heirlooms, love twisted by secrecy, and guilt buried so deep it became part of the landscape. The room remained still, the weight of generations pressing down on every breath. Clara said nothing. Her face, once so composed, had begun to tremble, not in defiance but in recognition. Mrs. Halbert's voice did not rise, did not accuse, it simply told the truth. "Fear," she said at last, her words echoing in the hollow of the nave, "can be inherited just as surely as blood. And when fear festers, even love turns sharp." There was no applause, no condemnation, only the rustling of robes, the creak of pews, and the sound of something ancient unraveling, quietly, irrevocably, beneath the watching eyes of stained-glass saints who had seen too much, and still wept in silence. It was not the trembling hands of Mrs. Ellingham, arthritic and stiff with age, that had brewed the lethal concoction. No, the precision of the tonic was too refined, too perfectly proportioned to be the result of trial and error. It whispered instead of someone well-versed, someone for whom the delicate balance of leaves, roots and sap was as natural as breath, someone who had been trained not by books but by long summers in a garden where knowledge was passed in quiet murmurs and watchful eyes. It was Miss Hargrove, gently spoken, but razor-sharp, who traced the web back to its spinner, not through grand revelations or dramatic confessions, but by noticing a quiet oddity, a faint smear, almost invisible, along the bottom edge of Celia Ashcombe's gardening apron. At the harvest fair, Miss Hargrove had seen it, a dull smudge she had assumed to be earth, or perhaps berry jam, brushed there while arranging the church's autumn display, but later, as the pieces fell into place, that smudge returned to her mind like a whisper refusing to be forgotten. It was not ordinary soil, it was digitalis, foxglove sap, faintly green with a violet tint when dried, a mark no layperson would recognize, but unmistakable to a gardener fluent in the language of poisons. That apron, worn faithfully every week as Celia tended to the rosebeds and the creeping ivy by the old chapel wall, became her undoing, not stained by accident, but by haste, by a misstep in an otherwise careful act. When Miss Hargrove softly recounted what she had seen, Celia flinched, her hand brushing her apron's hem as if to shield it from view, her expression collapsing into something brittle and bare. There was no outburst, no denial, just a stillness, a kind of surrender, as though the weight of the secret had at last grown too heavy to bear. Inspector Mallory stepped forward with a gentleness that belied the gravity of his duty, his eyes scanning Celia not with condemnation, but with the sorrow of a man who had seen too many good intentions curdle into quiet horrors. Celia did not struggle. She only whispered as she passed the altar, her voice no louder than the breath of the candles flickering behind her. "I did it to protect him, and the memory of what the church used to be." Those few words hung in the air long after the doors closed behind her, like incense that clings even after the fire is gone. Miss Hargrove, seated hours later in her sun-drenched garden, where bees moved lazily among the snapdragons, and the world seemed once again harmless, poured tea into fine porcelain cups with practiced grace, the weight of recent events softened only slightly by ritual and routine. Across from her, the Reverend sat in pained silence, while old Mrs. Calthorne stirred her cup with trembling hands, saying nothing, needing nothing, her thoughts heavy as the autumn air. No one mentioned the trial to come, or the whispers that would surely echo through village lanes for weeks. Instead, they spoke softly of frost forecasts and seed catalogues, as if by turning to small things they might hold back the tide of sorrow. Yet even as they sipped their tea, the memory of Celia's last words lingered in Miss Hargrove's mind, a reminder that in the quietest corners of devotion, beneath the surface of kindness and tradition, there can lie the darkest truths, waiting patiently to bloom in silence. The sunlight filtered lazily through the gauzy curtains of the vicarage drawing-room, casting quiet patterns upon the worn rug as the scent of late roses drifted in through a partially opened window. But beneath the surface calm, something unspoken simmered still. Miss Halbert's tea tray sat untouched on the side table, its delicate porcelain cups now cold, while the gathered company offered polite conversation that fluttered thinly above deeper, unacknowledged thoughts. Miss Ellery's nervous laughter came too quickly, her gloved hands twitching slightly at each mention of the church renovations, while Dr. Bennet stirred his tea absently, his gaze fixed not on the company but somewhere distant, as if sifting through memories best left undisturbed. Miss Rowan, usually so garrulous, sat withdrawn, her eyes flicking often toward the window as if expecting someone, or something to appear. Only Miss Elspeth Lorne, with her straight back and composed smile, seemed untouched, though Miss Marwood's sharp old eyes noted the faintest tremor in her fingers as she lifted her cup. The conversation veered purposefully toward trivialities: organ recitals, harvest baking, an out-of-place robin seen in the nave. But each remark hung slightly too long in the air, each smile too measured, each pause too careful. Miss Marwood said little, but observed much, and it was in the subtle shifts of tone, the half-glances exchanged, the sudden hush when the clock struck 3, that she traced the shadow left behind by what had passed. It had begun as such things often do, with a sudden death cloaked in unfortunate timing, a collapse in the vestry during storm preparations, blamed easily on age and stress. Yet the uneasy hush that followed, the reluctance to speak of the Reverend's peculiar behavior that week, the sealed cupboard in the sacristy, and the hurried replacement of the communion wine, all clung to Miss Marwood's thoughts like morning mist refusing to lift. The truth, when it came, was neither loud nor scandalous, but unsettling in its quiet inevitability. A letter misfiled in the prayer box, its contents partially burned, but still legible enough to hint at an arrangement, a failed blackmail, and a tragic decision disguised as natural demise. It was Miss Lorne, as it turned out, whose spotless reputation masked the darkest secret, not murder but concealment, knowing and persistent, carried not out of malice, but misguided devotion to a family name, once stained and desperately kept clean. Miss Marwood had found the final piece in a forgotten journal, belonging to the former caretaker, a single line about the cellar key being moved days before the incident. In that moment the pattern formed with chilling clarity. Now in the drawing-room of Fragile Peace, as the others began to speak of harvest songs and jam preserves, Miss Marwood let the conversation drift, her gaze steady on Miss Lorne's composed figure. Justice in this case would be silent, a contained truth, not broadcast but known, understood by those who needed to know. Later that evening, as the lamplight glowed amber and the village bells marked the hour with distant solemnity, Miss Marwood sat alone in her modest parlor, her embroidery untouched beside her, and pondered the curious nature of hidden truths. How silence, when pressed too long against guilt, becomes a burden heavier than any verdict. The village, she thought, would return to normal, as villages do, folding away the tale like a delicate letter in a locked drawer. Yet she knew the undercurrent would remain, soft but indelible, a reminder that even the most peaceful places held corners where secrets could bloom in the shadows. The mystery had been solved, yes, but in solving it a deeper truth had surfaced. that behind every respectable smile might lie a decision made in quiet desperation, and that sometimes, the most damning evidence was not blood or motive, but a single misplaced word left too long unsaid. As the church bells of Ashcombe Hollow rang their familiar chime, an uneasy stillness draped itself over the village like the lingering mist that clung to the hedgerows at dawn, innocuous to the eye, yet thick with untold stories. Miss Aloan Hartley, though rarely one for dramatics, could not ignore the shiver that traced her spine as she stepped into St. Gertrude's Chapel that Sunday morning. The congregation, faces as familiar as old portraits, sat arranged in patterns of habit and memory, but one pew, near the rear and beneath the stained glass window of St. Michael, sat conspicuously empty, as though its very silence hummed with disquiet. Not long ago that seat had cradled the frail figure of Mabel Dorset, widow, midwife, and quiet guardian of countless village secrets. Her sudden disappearance, dismissed by some as a simple departure to visit distant kin, had instead left behind a ripple of unanswered questions, and a peculiar scent of lavender and burnt wax in her shuttered cottage. Miss Hartley, with her ever watchful eyes and mind sharpened by years of careful observation, had noticed the small things, the scorched edge of a parchment in Mabel's hearth, a single crimson bead caught in the floorboards, and most curiously, a misplaced funeral register from decades past. Beneath the surface of cordial greetings and exchanged jam recipes, a truth was coiling, tight, cold and venomous. The village was not so much grieving Mabel, as avoiding the shape of her absence. Even Reverend Whitlow's sermons had turned cautious, measured, as if fearing his own voice might awaken something long buried. In quiet corners, whispers fluttered like bats of an old betrayal, of a child never christened, and of Mabel's final confession left unspoken in a sealed envelope never sent. As Aloan sipped her tepid tea that afternoon, she stared at the fire and let the silence stretch around her. Not all disappearances demand drama, she thought. Some slip through the cracks like smoke through a forgotten chimney. Yet the past, she knew, was not a relic, but a lodger. It lingered in pages left unturned, in songs hummed absently, and in pews that suddenly felt too quiet. The mystery wasn't merely Mabel's vanishing, but the collective hush that followed, the village's willful blindness to truths wrapped in silk and soot. She considered with a chill of clarity, how silence could be both a balm and a blade, comforting until it cut. And as the embers crackled softly, Aloan knew the story wasn't over. The pew would fill again someday, perhaps with someone who would unknowingly brush shoulders with the weight of a forgotten truth. So now I ask you, had you stumbled upon Mabel's scorched confession, or glimpsed the name hidden in the register's brittle pages, would you have opened the past to daylight, or allowed the village's delicate peace to persist? Would you have chosen truth, or chosen quiet? I'm eager to hear your thoughts below. Tell me, what would you have done, if this tale unsettled you, intrigued you, or simply reminded you of the quiet power of secrets? Do subscribe and share it with fellow lovers of thoughtful mysteries. Together, let's continue uncovering the soft, sinister echoes that lie just beneath the surface of everyday life. Until next time, stay observant, for even the gentlest villages have shadows that whisper.